Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining our webinar about the usage of Gurobi's Gurobot and more broadly, the impact of Gen AI on the practice of optimization. I am Mike Mensch, the Business Development Manager at Princeton Consultants. Um, you're seeing a couple of slides here about us. So we are trusted AI and optimization experts. We were founded in 1981. We are a solutions and services firm. We develop optimization and AI-powered solutions, and we provide related services um, around that. I'm trying to get to, there we go. Our practice leaders regularly publish and present on applied AI and optimization through a variety of channels, informs, live events, webinars, etc. This webinar being one of them. We do have another webinar coming up in 2 weeks. Our colleague Rob Randall will be talking about large-scale applied optimization solutions. And then lastly, we are a proud Gurobi Premier Partner. We train folks and teams in using Gurobi. We develop and deploy from scratch and then along the life cycle continuum solutions powered by Gurobi. And if there are third-party existing Gurobi powered models, we review, test, and improve them. Now, on to today. I'll exit that, share. Our webinar presenters are Jerry Yurchisin and Irv Lustig. Jerry is a senior data science strategist at Gurobi with over a decade of experience in operations research, data science, and visualization. Jerry specializes in enhancing decision-making with the right analytical approach. At Gurobi, Jerry aims to promote the integration of mathematical optimization into the data science and AI communities as a critical component of decision intelligence. Irv is the optimization principal at Princeton Consultants, an internationally recognized leader in operations research and advanced analytics. Irv has authored more than 30 articles and scientific papers and has received the Beal Orchard Hayes Prize for Excellence in Computational Mathematical Programming. Today, we are planning to go for 1 hour, leaving time for questions at the end. Post your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. We are recording this webinar. We'll make the recording available, and we will send copies of the slides afterwards. And on that note, I will turn it over to Jerry.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate it. And I also appreciate going through my experience first so someone could, at least for a little bit, think, wow, that's pretty impressive before hearing all the great things that Irv has done over his career. So thanks for inviting me to speak. And I'm going to talk about sort of Gurobot stories, lessons learned and whatnot from our perspective and talk about really sort of focusing on sort of how things have been used, how Gurobot has been used, and sort of what Gurobi is looking forward to in the future when it comes to use of generative AI and optimization. So my little agenda for about the 20 or so minutes that I plan to talk is first we're going to talk about what Gurobot really is and the evolution of generative AI at Gurobi and then also how Gurobot has been used. So a little bit of high-level statistics about usage and what people are asking, to sort of see what people have been using Gurobot for. And then I'm going to give a very brief and very high-level introduction to the Gurobi Intelligence Hub, where Gurobot sits, and talk about other things that we're going to be thinking about and working on in the future. And then give you a little bit of information of where to learn more about what we're doing and what we're working on in the future. And I know I'm probably going to have give you're going to have probably a lot more questions than I can answer. So I'm going to hopefully direct you to some places in which you can get some answers to your questions when we're ready to sort of reveal more. So first, I'm going to talk about what Gurobot is and the evolution of generative AI at Gurobi. So if you are not familiar with Gurobot, it is sort of our first real effort into incorporating sort of a generative AI tool to help people who use Gurobi. So it is, it's sort of, I guess, you can call it like a typical sort of nowadays, a typical chatbot in a sense, but it is really built on our knowledge base. It has access to our knowledge base articles, which are, hundreds and hundreds written by our experts and other optimization experts that are at Gurobi. It also looks into our documentation, code examples, use cases, and modeling. So this is sort of like the differentiation. If you just sort of think, why would I want to use Gurobot versus just sort of vanilla ChatGPT or vanilla Claude or something like that? This is sort of what you're getting in addition to sort of the normal LLM experience. Also access to the LM has access to and our chatbot has access to these types of knowledge. So, and also it is a tool that is backed by and improved by our experts team. And when I say our experts team, I mean our product support team. If you submit a ticket and things like that, you're talking with our experts team. These are the folks that are sort of behind the scenes to help improve Gurobot and things like that. So, if you do start a conversation, you want to then, hey, I'm a customer and I want to actually sort of get more help from a person. Um, you can easily convert, conversations that you have with Gurobot to tickets to get the expert support that you need. And when Gurobot gets something wrong, and notice I say when and not if, um, all the chats that have a bad rating, if you give it a thumbs down, they are reviewed and we take action where possible. What I mean by that is if it seems like it's that you got a bad answer or some incorrect stuff, because it's just typical LLM stuff that happens. Sometimes you just get bad answers, and that's just sort of the nature of the beast here. Then we sort of chalk it up to that. But if it does seem like, hey, we're missing some critical piece of information that we can incorporate into our knowledge base, or maybe write things a little bit more clearly, we do take that very seriously, and we do update our documentation and update our knowledge base based off of your feedback. So if you do use Gurobot and things aren't going perfectly, or you think there's room for improvement, do feel free to give us feedback through that. And so I do want to mention, what is Gurobot's goal? It is the first line of product support. So again, we want to shift the time our experts spend on tickets to things that are, sort of higher impact questions that you may have. So things that maybe you can answer in a couple minutes. Maybe just fire up Gurobot and you have a licensing issue, and next thing you know, you sort of have that solved. So that's sort of the goal of Gurobot, is to really sort of help with that first line of product support. So the evolution of generative AI modeling at Gurobi, we started way back, several years ago with an initial version of Gurobot, which is something you could find on the ChatGPT store when that was really a thing. We then sort of evolved that into what we call a modeling assistant to really help with the formulation of mathematical optimization problems. And then we sort of noticed that, we weren't getting great prompts for these. We weren't getting very well developed problem statements. So we developed something that we called a prompt engineer to help sort of with with the sort of problem statement development and some documentation on sort of best practices at the time. We have sort of moved away from a little bit from this what we call Gurobi AI modeling, and I used our old logo sort of on purpose to sort of show that we're moving on to other things right now, and maybe we'll be revisiting these, maybe not. We'll sort of see. But this is our focus now is Gurobot and is a Gurobi supported thing. We have a lot more tools evolving, which I'm going to start diving into very little bit at a high level. And this is something that we're calling Gurobi intelligence. So that's sort of where we started, where we are. And now I'm going to sort of shift over to how Gurobot has been used over the last several months. So it's high level data on what's being asked of Gurobot. So there's a couple of things I'm going to talk about. One is, if you sort of look at essentially the data that Gurobot that the chats produce, there's a lot of things that are directly measured. So, the number of users that we have, session lengths, number of sessions, things of that nature. Those are very directly measured. You can sort of count these things. But we also did take another view and sort of looking at inferred features. So like using using another LLM to sort of identify what people are talking about. What is the primary issue? What were you trying to really solve in your session with Gurobot? Did things go well? Did it not go well? So these are things that we're also looking into to sort of see how things are going and help how we can help improve Gurobot in future generative AI tools. So the data that I'm going to sort of skim through really quickly here is starts from September 1st of last year through just a few days ago, May 31st of this year. So first, let's talk about the scale of usage, sort of the active weekly users, sort of hovering around, when we started, kind of like 200 total-ish, and now we're a little sort of you can see a trend line going up over time. The blue color is represents the academic people using, so students or faculty or something like that using Gurobot, and then the red color is commercial. Um, and we sort of see, yeah, there's a sort of been a general increase over time, a little bit more adoption as you go from September to now. You could see maybe there's a little bit of when you look over at the unique users on the right-hand side, the cumulative number of that there's we're sort of leveling off a little bit in terms of the commercial aspect, but the academic users are still sort of growing. And sort of this makes sense to us at this point. So there's nothing really super surprising, but it is encouraging to see a lot of people using this and a lot of people still coming back sort of week over week and things like that. So that's very encouraging for us. And then sort of the number of sessions, the number of sessions over time sort of mirrors uh, the weekly users as well. But on the right-hand side, we do see we noticed that there was that the number of unique users was sort of flattening out from the commercial perspective, but we don't see that with the number of sessions. So we do see we're sort of seeing that that we don't have that flattening out. So more commercial users are sort of coming back and using having more sessions with Gurobot and academic as well. So it's all encouraging stuff that we see, and we're happy to sort of see the usage increasing over time. So sort of what I was just talking about is that we're seeing sort of a little bit of a leveling off of a certain type of user from the commercial perspective, but we're seeing a steady increase in sessions that comes from we're getting a little bit more what we were going to call sort of power users. So if you sort of look at along the horizontal axis is the cumulative share of users, what percentage of the user base, and then the cumulative proportion or share of sessions. So essentially, reading this chart, you can say that 20% of our academic users make up about 50%, a little over 50% of our sessions overall. That's great. We see a bunch of people using it. Cool. What are they using it for? And these are again some inferred issues that we see through the chats and everything. And you can see look at that top bar, that licensing entitlements. Like, how do I get access to my license? I have license questions, things like that. That is above and beyond like the number one issue, and very again very academic heavy in that perspective. Then you sort of look at what's the next most popular one, and people are asking modeling questions of Gurobot, and then also things like API usage, concept explanation, and what that really means is explain to me sort of what branch and bound means, or explain to me, column generation or something like that, where it's not a very directed question, but it's more like, hey, I want to know more about a general concept. That is also something that's heavily involved in our knowledge base. We have lots of bits and pieces and articles about that kind of stuff as well. So it is a good resource for that. Then also things like parameter tuning, installation, sort of round out the top use cases. the top issues for how people are currently using Gurobot. And if you sort of go back to what I said was the original sort of, okay, well, what is Gurobot's goal? It is to answer like sort of these questions that you want sort of a quick response for, and that can be solved with, with an LLM sort of rather quickly to sort of get you on your way and give sort of our expert teams some more time to focus on your more pressing issues. So things like license entitlements, installation, some instances of parameter tuning, account access, these are all sort of these are the things that Gurobot was designed to help our customers, our users with. So having those sort of be really high up on the number of issues is sort of identifying to us that Gurobot is doing what it's designed to do. And of course, so we are having a little bit of a focus on this presentation about like, hey, how can we, what's the modeling capability, or what are people using for Gurobot for in terms of modeling or model types and things like that. This is a both academic and commercial, so this is an overall picture. Um, by and large, people are asking about, hey, can I have some help on my MIPS? And we did exclude a lot of unknown, again, if you're talking about licensing issues, you're not really talking about a model type necessarily. So getting rid of those types of issues, we're talking about like we know that that's modeling questions or API questions or something like that. These are the types of models in which people are mostly asking of, and I think this is kind of just reflective overall of the of sort of like the Gurobi sort of user base. Very heavy on MIPS, a lot of LP, and then a sort of smattering of the quadratic families, and also nonlinear, which includes mixed integer nonlinear as well, sort of bringing up the rear a little bit. But it is nice to see that people are using Gurobot to sort of answer all their questions, no matter what model type overall. But again, a heavy dominance towards the mixed integer linear program. So that is the sort of high level sort of hey, how people are using Gurobot so far, and how that's aligning to sort of the original purpose of Gurobot and everything like that. So I'm going to give a very, very high level introduction, sort of sneak peek, I guess, into what we're calling the Gurobi Intelligence Hub. So I talked about Gurobi Intelligence a little bit before, and as like sort of a new block of what we're focusing on in terms of generative AI tools. How is that going to sort of, what's our current vision on how that can come together? So this is kind of like an idea of what we're looking at, of what the intelligence hub could look like. We have Gurobot there as well, again, sort of for your first line of product support. And we have sort of concepts for the what we call an explainer. And one of the big things about optimization modeling is, hey, I have an infeasible model. Why is it infeasible? I have a bunch of questions about this, and my end users have questions about this, and all sorts of stuff. So we feel that can be a very good tool for optimization modelers and end users alike to be able to sort of get the answers that they need from these instances. And then, of course, building models is also very important, and we have seen that generative AI can help there. Again, the whole purpose of this is to sort of see, yeah, it can help, but here's the asterisk, here's the grain of salt that comes along with that. But we sort of have seen a little bit of a mismatch between how people use generative AI for modeling and how people would go about a modeling process in practice, and that's something that Irv is going to hit on, I think, rather nicely. And of course, we want to make sure that at all these sort of things at work where you want to work. So we do have a vision of putting these things in coding assistance and your ID and things like that. So I'm going to talk about, I already talked about Gurobot. I'm going to talk about the other two, the explainer modeler, just a very little bit to give a little bit of an introduction. The modeler is modeling just with Gen AI, just a fancy party trick. And sort of a quick sort of anecdote personally from I remember trying to start using generative AI to help me with modeling, years and years ago when this stuff really started coming out. And I remember trying to get some version of ChatGPT to write a MIP for a Sudoku problem. It's literally an example that we have. Tons of people have examples. And several years ago, probably 4 years ago or something like that, um, it botched it. Did not do did not do that right. But now, if you were to ask any sort of vanilla instance of generative AI, be it some version of ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, whatever you're working for, it's going to get that right. So just the improvements over the last several years have been interesting, and part of the reason why we feel this can be helpful to modelers and anyone really. So we think that there is some there, but there's a lot of gaps that need to be cleared. So if you're to sort of think about in using generative AI, one thing that is probably news to zero people is that it's very overconfident. And a lot of things that happen is, oh, I'm sorry, you're right about this. If you call it out for doing something very wrong, which happens a lot, or happens enough, I guess I should say, happens enough to where this has happened to a lot of us. Oh, I'm sorry, let me fix that. You're right. Let's go back. Again, this overconfidence in the answers that LLMs as a whole produce is something that is prevalent, and no matter how you use this technology for optimization modeling or whatever else we may be trying to use it for. So I just want to sort of highlight one sort of kind of funny instance, I think, in which the question was like, hey, how can I make my model run faster, more or less? And Gurobot gave some really good things, really good sort of high level. Hey, you should look about parameter tuning. You should, in some instances, and this is the thing that Irv is going to hit on, is like the big M versus indicator constraints that Gurobi has. Like, which is the right? What should I be doing for my particular case? In this case, it recommended maybe indicator constraints could be helpful for you instead of writing things in big M. Is that always the case? You know, definitely not. It can be or may not be. But here's a bunch of good things that you can look into. But then if you look over here about this expected improvement, you kind of just have to chuckle at this. Like, okay, how is this coming about? No, but so you just get like sort of you just need to keep in mind like what generative AI tools are, what LMs are, and how they you can kind of get some weird things like this, and you kind of just have to have the domain expertise and the optimization expertise to really sort of suss through some of this stuff. So I want to talk about, with the how people use generative AI for modeling and how it kind of doesn't align with like how it actually works in practice. Is you think about what you would do if you're going to ask a Gurobot or any LLM about how can I I have an optimization modeling problem. How can I get some help? You would fire it up and essentially say, here's my entire optimization problem and some data, model it and solve it. We kind of have this sort of like, here's everything that I have, sort of just spew it all out, help me do this thing. And of course, generative AI and LLMs being what it is, says, of course, I can do anything you ask. And it churns away and it does its thing and it thinks and it tells you kind of what it's thinking, which is cool. And then it says, okay, all done. Here are the results. I did everything that you asked. And then you look at that and you're like, that's not right. There are some issues here. So this is kind of how we use generative AI, and it's not exactly how it aligns in practice. So here's how it can be discussed. So you fire it up again, and maybe a better starting point is here is a high level description of my optimization problem, and then okay, because that's how you would in practice present this is like here's like at a higher level, here's what we're trying to do. And then a tool like a new robot or a modeler, I would say, the model like a modeling agent would say, here's some options for it, objectives, constraints. Here's some things to think about. Let's have a conversation about this, more or less, go back and forth. And your response will be like, okay, thanks. I'll select some of the things that you're talking about. Here's some more information. And then, hey, here's a summarization of where we are so far. Let's have a document about this. Let's have this document that here's several tests that we can do we know that this point should be infeasible. We know that this point should be feasible. Does that actually happen? Things like that. There are ways to sort of test this that you actually do in practice that sort of get glossed over when you use generative AI. And then also talking about, okay, here's how things changed last time, and here's how we need to update things. And so there's instead of just like this, sort of one shot of like, here's all my information, it's a more cyclical thing. And this is how we sort of want to have our a modeling agent sort of work in such an intelligence hub for us. So then now I'm going to sort of pivot over to the explainer, and I'm going to be sort of quick, a little bit more quicker on the explainer and everything from here on out. Um, so end users, and an end user can be someone with a lot of optimization experience or maybe not, but you can have a lot of questions, particularly about when it comes to things like infeasibility and sensitivity analysis, counterfactuals. Why is this why is this in particular solution infeasible? Why am I not meeting, why is my supply not meeting my demand? How can I sort of fix this with minimal changes? Things like that. These are all sort of very important questions that we have about our optimization model, and it just so happens that there's a lot of ways that be it through sort of Gurobi native sort of tools, something like our IS tool or Fees Relax and things like that, or through some modeling tricks and things like that, you can get answers for a lot of these questions. And we think that generative AI can really help a modeler sort of get through this faster, and someone who's maybe not as experienced can sort of maybe get some answers using these things, and generative AI can really help there. The last thing I want to hit on is again the working where you want to work, and that's a thing that we think is very important. So we want to um, make all of these agents that are part of the Intelligence Hub act accessible through things like Claude Code and VS Code. I think I probably gave, again, maybe more questions than answers at this moment. So what I want to talk about, or what I want to sort of direct people to now, is we're going to have a much more in-depth webinar on this presented by Steve Edwards, our senior product manager, who's sort of leading a lot of this stuff next week, June 11th. And the times are listed below. So if you're interested in hearing more, this is a good place to get a little bit more information, a lot more in-depth information about Gen AI and Gurobi. Before I hand it off to Irv to talk about his experience here, I think we can a poll question just popped up. So you sort of saw some of the usages that we're sort of tagging in Gurobot now. We'd like to see how you have used Gurobot in each of the following areas, and then sort of give what you've used and how you used it, and then we'll come back to this a little bit later. Thanks again, and I'll hand it off to Irv.
All right, thank you, Jerry. Let me get my screen now shared. I'm going to close the poll for me. Um, okay, so I'm going to give what I call Gurobot modeling stories. Some of my experience in using Gurobot for modeling, and to give you a perspective on where things are today. It will be interesting to see how the new model layer that will be part of Gurobi Intelligence will be, what that will do in the future. But this is kind of where things are today. And what the first two examples I'm going to use are actually places where I was pretty sure I had written out the model correctly on a piece of paper, and I said, hey, let me see what Gurobot says. Maybe they have a different way of doing it, and it confirmed that I had modeled it right. And then the third example will be a little bit different, and I'll introduce that when I get to it. So here's my first example, a simple modeling example. I had a problem I was working on that I had a case where I've got a sequence of binary variables, and I want a constraint to represent that two of them must equal one and that the two are consecutive. Now, I'm not going to go through the details of exactly what's saying here, but you can see in green, I've got the Gurobot response, which was the recommended methodology was to come up with some additional binary variables B, and then you can say, which represents that whether a particular pair has been selected, are these linkages between the B's and the A variables down here, and that you want exactly two of them to be set. And I said, hey, great, this is exactly what I had written down on a piece of paper. It confirmed that my modeling intuition was right, so I felt pretty good about that. And then it also provided some additional approaches and a final recommendation saying the approach one, the one that I showed on the prior slide, is the most efficient and cleanest formulation for Gurobi. It's only linear constraints, and the solver can handle it efficiently. So in this case, I was using Gurobot to confirm how I was going to model something by hand that I had written out on a piece of paper because it wasn't something I had modeled previously in other applications. And so it confirmed that, hey, I was on the right path for what I needed to implement in my particular model. So I felt pretty good about that. Here's now story number two. So story number two was I said, hey, I have an integer variable y with an upper bound u and a lower bound 0, and I want to have a binary variable that basically says when the y variable hits the upper bound, it's that then our binary is equal to 1. Otherwise, the binary is equal to 0 if the integer variable was smaller than u. So the response from Gurobi was there were two different methods. And it says you should recommended first that I should use indicator constraints. And the second method was to use what's known as the big M formulation, which is in method 2, which is the way that I would naturally model it because I'm used to writing out linear constraints. I also know that the linear constraints will definitely give me a linear relaxation that's tighter, and I'm not so sure what's going on under the hood when we use indicator constraints. Sometimes it is converted to underneath to the big M formulation. Other times it's not. It has to do with numerics, etc. So having seen these two responses from Gurobot in terms of the options here, I then said, I think the big M formulation, the second method, is better. All right. And then it actually, before it told me that, it gave me also saying, hey, here's why you should use indicator constraints. They're easy to read. Gurobi is great in handling them internally. They'd avoid potential numerical issues. It makes the logical structure of your model clearer. The linear constraints might be useful if you're working with the solver doesn't support indicator constraints. Well, I'm working with Gurobi, so that's not a problem. I want complete control over the formulation, but that really does speak to me while I'm interfacing with older code. And it was more that second bullet that kind of mattered to me, is I really want to understand what's happening in the formulation. So in my particular example, my values of U were small. They were going to be less than 20. I said, are indicator constraints really better than a linear formulation? One thing I should point out here is I was typing quickly and I misspelled formulation. I really copied this right from the Gurobot interaction, so I didn't correct my spelling here. So fortunately, it knew that I had spelled the word formulation incorrectly. And I got the response, excellent question. You need that big pat on the back and confidence saying that, hey, if U is small, the linear formulation is likely to perform just as well or even slightly better than the indicator constraint, and here's why, and it gives the reasons why. So as I mentioned, you get a very tighter LP relaxation. There's no numerical issues. It's only no special constraint handling. You get better pre-solve. There's no, if you have indicator constraint, there is some overhead for using that. And I have complete transparency in what's getting solved and direct control of the formulation, easier debugging and model inspection. So these are all the things that I knew from my experience, which is why I wanted to ask the question, is that my sense is that the linear formulation would be better, right? And then Gurobot gave me some additional details saying, hey, interconstraints still have value because of this repeatability, maintainability, but the practical recommendation says that for a small U, use the linear formulation if performance is critical. I want a simple model, and I'm working with production code where every detail matters. And given that our work at Princeton, as Mike mentioned earlier, is we deliver production systems where we embed Gurobi inside of systems that people are going to be using to make decisions. That kind of speaks to the kind of things that I want to worry about. And it says use indicator constraints. Hey, if model clarity and maintainability are more priorities, if the U value might change, or if I'm prototyping or teaching. So, I generally live in the linear constraint world. Maybe if I had something simple, I was doing a prototype, I would write indicator constraints. But in general, another reason I would use linear constraints is I do things with Gurobi PyPandas, and I don't know if indicator constraints are supported with that. So I'm just so used to living in the linear world. So morals of the first two stories is that Gurobot can really handle a simple directed modeling question and can help avoid you looking up how to model certain kinds of conditions. On the other hand, you really want to have some expertise is needed so you can challenge Gurobot on its conclusions. And that's kind of the theme here, is that you can't just put this in the hands of anybody. You do want to have some expertise to be able to say, hey, Gurobot, are you right? Is there something wrong that you might be doing, or are you potentially misleading me? I did these fun little things created by GenAI, of course, to add to the story. So now I'm going to go to my last example. So my last example was actually motivated by a prospect who came in and said, they went to a GenAI, I think they eventually went to Gurobot, and they described the problem, and they got Gurobi code, and they ran Gurobi, and they complained that Gurobi was only getting solutions within 30% of optimality. So I've changed that example here to illustrate what can happen if you take the perspective of not an optimization expert, but the person who doesn't know much about how to do optimization. They're like the type of people that Gurobi, with their new intelligence hub and the Gurobi modeler, are hoping will be able to get some value, and maybe in the future this example would be one that it would give value for. So let me give you a basic description of the problem. Is that we have a set of items that have attributes. They have a color, a size, a model, and a power. We have a price for each of those items, and we have a certain number of quantity that are available. And then we have a set of constraints, and what the constraints say is that for an attribute type, which could be the color, size, model, or power, a particular value of that attribute, what percentage of the budget we can want to allocate towards items that have that particular attribute. All right, and then we tell Gurobi that I want to choose a set of items that where we can only choose an integer number of items, and we tell it that what the price of the items are and what the quantity is that it's available. And then we explain the constraints. It says compute the total value, which is determined by summing the price of each item times its chosen quantity of the items with that particular attribute type. And then you look for the ones that have that corresponding value and attribute, and you compare the total value to the percentage of the budget. And that the target value of each constraint should be as close as possible to the desired percentage. So this is a description of a problem. I've got these percentages of these different attributes, and I want to pick the items so that I get the percentages as close as possible. And then I say, please give me a mathematical model and some Gurobi code to solve this problem, preferably using Gurobi PyPandas. So the first response from Gurobi is, hey, I need you to tell me something. Please answer these questions so I can provide you with the most accurate solution. And then it gives me a preliminary mathematical formulation based on the current understanding. And I've omitted here that preliminary mathematical formulation. And it gives me a context saying it's an item selection problem where we want to choose quantities of different items such that the value distribution across the various attributes matches the specified percentage targets of a budget. And here's the math model, which I put on this other page. And I'm not going to go through the details. We have a set of items. We have the set of constraints. We have the prices and the quantities and the budget. And then we have an indicator whether for each item, whether it has that particular attribute of that type, the target percentage for each constraint, the attribute value, and for the constraints and the attribute types. And our decision variables are going to be how much we choose of each item, and then how much we deviate from our target for each one of those constraints. And then it gives me the mathematical model. Again, I'm not going to go through the details here, but we have quantity limits. This is the key constraint that basically says we sum over, for each constraint, we sum over the attributes of all the items that have that attribute value of its price, and then we look at the deviation, either the negative or the positive deviation from hitting our percentage of our budget, and then it wrote an optional budget constraint saying, wait, is that part of the thing? And then it gives me an objective function. So one of the questions it was asking me is, is there a constraint on the budget? That's why it listed this as optional. And then it says, here's a number of different objective functions. We can look at the sum of the absolute deviations, the square deviations, or the maximum deviation. But please can you clarify these questions? So the questions were about the total budget constraint, and I said, hey, that's necessary, and that the difference of the total amount spent should be part of the objective function, as we want to get as closest to the budget as possible without exceeding the budget, and then use option 1 in terms of the objective function. So realize now in putting this together, I probably should include the questions that it put forward. I think I left out that slide by mistake, so I'll add that my next time I do this. But anyhow, it basically asked me, hey, is there a constraint on the budget? And which of these objective functions do you want to use? So then gives me a response. It gave me an entire set of Python code, which I'm going to talk about momentarily. And it basically says, hey, I've created a complete item selection optimizer. It uses Gurobi pandas. It has the hard budget constraint, deviation tracking for each attribute constraint, budget utilization objective to minimize the underspending, and minimizing the sum of all absolute deviations. And it highlights that it used an object-oriented design, uses a context manager. It separated the concerns, data loading, model building optimization, solution extraction. So it's very happy to see that it was using best coding practices, which actually, if you look at a number of Gurobi examples, don't always do that. So I was very happy with that. Use Gurobi pandas. And then it also created a solution report. And then it created a sample problem, says it used 100% of the budget. I didn't want to give it my data because my data is proprietary to me. A total deviation of only $420, selected 7 items, and most of the attributes met their targets exactly very closely. And then it tells me how to use it with my data. I have to replace the sample data, which I had put in data frames, with just putting in read CSVs and setting a particular budget. So it told me exactly what I have to do to be able to use its code. It also showed me the data that it had. So you can see here's an example data set. There's different items. They have the 4 attributes and different values of those attributes and their prices and their quantities. And then it created some constraints. And again, Gurobot made up all this data to test its version of the model. And when you run this, that it actually, here's the Gurobi log, and you'll see that in 0.03 seconds, we got an optimal solution with 0% gap. So this is looking very promising for this very simple example that the Gurobot made up. And then it actually created a report. It says, hey, here's your budget. You've spent the whole budget. Here's your total objective value. And it actually gave me a report on the deviations for each one of the constraints in terms of what percentages and how the actual percentages were. And we can see our target, like for model, was 1750. The actual was 1580. And so it gave me the total deviation. So we can see there's our 170 plus 80 is 420. So get this, it created all of this nice reporting for me so I could understand what's going on. So I'm very excited now. I'm putting again myself the idea that I can now use optimization to solve my problem. So then I pick up the Python file, I pull it up into Visual Studio Code, and it's a bloody mess. Now, I like to use and have type checking on with Visual Studio Code in Python. And it basically I'm finding out here that, oh, wait a minute, this code isn't using the best coding practices. And the reason is that it created in its class, it initialized a whole bunch of things to none that eventually get changed over to values. And so from a typing perspective, if item data ends up being a data frame, what will happen is when we start using it in code, it'll say, wait a minute, you can't pass none. So you get all of these red marks about invalid calls just simply because it used this initialization and didn't understand this part of good coding practice. So the solution was I just commented out all that code, and now the typing checks are happy, and I don't have a bloody mess. So then I run it on my CSV, and you'll notice here now I have a problem. It's got 67 constraints and 1,096 variables, and we solved the problem. And I only wanted to give it a minute to solve, so I set a time limit of 60 seconds. And you can see that we got within 0.23% of optimality, but I didn't get my solution analysis, that nice report. So I'm like, why don't I get a report here because I want to make sure I can get solutions within 1 minute to my problem. So we take a little look at it and we see, the code that was created was testing, is the status of the optimization optimal? And what I want to say is, if you stopped and you found, okay, if I stopped and I have a solution, then just take that solution. So if we stop due to a time limit or any other limit and I have a feasible solution, let's make the change. Instead of testing for optimality, let's say if I have a solution, since I'm going to use time limits, and I had to change that in 2 places for displaying the results as well as for getting the actual solution. So simple one-line changes of the code. Again, I had to understand a little bit about how Gurobi works and what does it mean to stop after 1 minute and being able to get a solution. But I'm an experienced Gurobi user. I knew how to make that kind of change. So when I do that now, I get the output, and I'm abbreviating the output here from the data set that I had made up here. And all of a sudden, I'm looking at the answers, and I'm seeing some really big, huge variations in the targets and the percentages. Like, here's something I want 13%, and it couldn't make any of it. And yet another one it wanted 6%, and it got pretty close. So I want to investigate now, why is there such a huge variation here? This is not the kind of answer that I want to get from my optimizer. I want everything to be close to my target percentages. So I start looking at the data. And let's go back actually a slide here. You'll see that we had, for power of 8, we had a difference of 240,000. Let's see what was going on. All right. So we see here is that we have a lot of items that have power 8. Should have been able to pick one of these kinds of items here. Had a lot of those items. So I take a look now at the constraint, and there is a constraint that says the deviation for power 8, there was nothing that matched it. I'm like, yeah, there is. There's something that matched it, was equal to 0. So I've got to start now using my understanding of the model, what it wrote out, and its implementation to say, why did this happen? There's got to be some kind of bug. Well, it turns out that the attributes, when this is presented as a data frame, the attributes can have string values or numerical values. Well, power is always numerical, but because of the nature of the constraints here, let me go back, the nature of the constraints, that the attributes all get read in as strings by pandas. So to fix this bug, I basically, the old code said, hey, for every constraint, get the attribute type, attribute, and percentage, and then find the ones that match by looking at when the item data of that attribute type equals the value. But because each attribute has its own type, it could be integer or float, but because of the way pandas reads it in, it will read it in as a string. I have to change this to say, let's convert the items in the item table to be strings and say, does it equal the string of the attribute value? And that will give me everything that matches. So here, I've had to use a combination of my knowledge of Gurobi and modeling to see what was going on, plus my knowledge of pandas to see this was the issue as to why those were not being considered. So I do that, and I look at the optimization results. Again, I run it to a 60-second time limit. My gap is now up a bit to 2.34%, and I look at the report, and I still see there's some large values in here. And I'm trying to understand, why is there this large value? So I go back and I look at my data again, and when I filter on the different models that are there, there's no value, no items that had model R. So that there's a constraint that says we want 2% of things to be model R, but none of the items had model R. So therefore, it fixed the deviation to 30,000. So at this point, because again, I made up this problem, but remember, I was motivated by a potential client, I don't know whether I should be reporting this as a data issue. Hey, you asked for a constraint on attribute R, but you've got no items of attribute R. Do you want to fix that in your data? Or do I leave out these deviations? Do I say, hey, if there's no matching, it's here? I have to have a conversation now with the people who created this data and start understanding, how are they thinking about these types of issues with respect to the data, and And should we be measuring these deviations at all when we have no items that match? That starts being a business question. So there you can see I've highlighted here that the R's, there's nobody that had an R in the data. So if I take out the constraint about no items matching, so let's assume that's the answer, that we should ignore the case where there's no match. So I basically comment out this constraint. I now run the problem again, and I'm up to a gap of close to 13% after 1 minute. So, and we still look at the answers, and now things are looking a little bit better. I'm not seeing really large values. The power 8, we're still kind of wondering here why it's reporting this. This looks to be buggy in here. So the question is missing the target on power 5 acceptable? Right? How about missing the target on something on the $120,000 target for color aqua by only $342? Is that equivalent to missing $30,000 on power? And why is this wrong? I start having to ask lots and lots of questions. And the key question for me actually is really, do we want to compare looking at a value of 8%, which is a large value and kind of a small deviation, to when the target is smaller, is the same deviation? If we had a 10% deviation on that, let's say it was ended up being the same 342, is that better? So how do we want to think about percentages versus actual values? So these are questions that start to come up as you're trying to understand how people want to measure the quality of solution. So just to compare the results here, you can see that the original model that Gurobot gave me a higher objective value with a small MIP gap. Then I fixed that bug about attributes. It lowered the objective value and a higher MIP gap. And if I ignore all the matches, I get even a smaller objective and a higher MIP gap. So this brings up a set of questions for me. If you have a user of Gurobot who knows very little about how optimization works, what would they conclude about this? Would they stop earlier and think everything is okay? Would they be able to accept a solution without understanding the differences in how the data is being interpreted? And what would happen if the problem came back as infeasible? Would they understand how to analyze infeasibility? And maybe the explainer that will be in the Gurobi Intelligence Hub will be able to explain that. But if it starts talking about constraints and decision variables and you don't know about optimization, it still may be hard to understand. So the morals of this story are, I like to say, if you really want to leverage the best power of optimization, you kind of need an optimization translator. I mean, that's part of what myself and my colleagues do here at Princeton. You have to be able to have discussions about what I call TLCD, the targets or objectives, the limits, the constraints, the choices in your decision variables, and the data, organization, its data types, missing values. You have to have those discussions and understand how they interact in terms of creating an optimization solution. So that a training and optimization is really what makes you a good optimization translator to help translate business requirements into optimization model. So I'd like to say, but robot can really help the expert, but maybe not necessarily today, the novice. And we'll see how the Gurobi Intelligence Hub that you can learn more about next week might help close some of that gap. And let me add one more thing. I was involved with Informs in creating the Informs Analytics Framework, and it really is a framework for thinking about how to apply analytics in general and optimization specifically into solving optimization problems. You can't just be worrying about your data and your model development. You need to be thinking about how you frame understand the business problem, translate it into an optimization problem. We spend a lot of time with data, choosing which optimization methodology. You want to use MIP, LP, MIQCP, et cetera. Do you need some type of column generation algorithm or something that uses optimization multiple times? Then you develop your model. Then you worry about deployment. How do you write an application and how do you manage that application over time? So the Gurobi Intelligence, I think, is going to help close some of the things at the beginning of this. Whenever you're doing an application optimization, you really need to think about all of these issues. And this is something that we do here at Princeton Consultants. I've given other talks about this that are available on YouTube. So with that, I'm going to conclude and pass the mic back over to Mike to see if we have any questions.
All right, thanks, Irv, and thanks, Jerry. First, we're going to launch the results of, we're going to share the results of the poll. Are you able to see that?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. Um,
So,
Jerry, could you,
Yeah.
so first of all, a lot of folks not using it, have not used it yet.
Yeah. Well, I hope this presentation and Irv's experience with like yeah there's some good there, there's some gaps that need to be closed and everything, get more people to use it, but what I'll say is like outside of that I have not used it, so I hope people give it a go. And again, as I mentioned, if things aren't going well and you sort of think this is not an acceptable answer and you want to thumbs down something, that's okay. We kind of want that because it'll help us improve. But like outside of that, and no one's worrying about licensing entitlements, which I think may make sense. It kind of follows the same as the chart that I presented. Once you get rid of that, like model formulations up there, API usage, concept explanation, it sort of actually goes pretty much in exact order. So I find that pretty interesting. Outside getting rid of, so I feel that maybe this group that we have here is, probably more experienced. They're not worried about and sort of got well past the licensing issues, but maybe there are some things that you can sort of get a little bit of help with here and there. Yeah, if I sort of I find that pretty interesting that it outside of a couple things, it follows the same trajectory, same distribution.
Yeah, you do wonder if for the non-users, having now attended this webinar, are they motivated to try it? The proof will be in the pudding. Q&A, folks, you can post a question in the Q&A. If you don't see it at the bottom, select there's a more button as well in your dashboard there. Um, Irv, any other thoughts about
yeah. Um, so there's a question there. Maybe I
oh,
think it's better for Jerry. Somebody asked, how do I get
oh,
it from my IDE?
Um, tune in tune in on next week for more information on that and what that looks like. It yeah. I'm not gonna one spoil, and things may change and everything like that. Does it support for Java code? I'll say that, yeah, independent of, I didn't put a slide up on modeling languages and what people are, or what coding languages people are using. By and large, it's Python, but it does, yeah. Since it's looking into our documentation and looking into some examples that we have, and our knowledge base, which does cover Java, not as in depth as Python, because Python's our most popular programming language. You can get Java help. Yeah.
Next question, comment
now we
is, I've had success using Amazon Q, which is already integrated into PyCharm, solving questions specific to Gurobi. Are there any specific types of questions that you recommend are better posed to Gurobot?
Hmm. Um, I would say, yeah. I mean, if it's already doing a good job solving Groby specific questions, I'd say um, maybe things along like analyzing like a log file or something like that, and seeing what improvements and what maybe some parameter suggestions or something like that would be something that would be that Growbot can help with specifically. Understanding, getting explanations on specific parameters that you may want more information about, how to use them. I think could probably be something that's a little bit interesting, that maybe may or may not be part of Amazon Q or something that would be helpful there. Because again, I mean, I'm sure that all these LLMs are taking in a lot of the same information, like uh, uh, our public knowledge base articles, our documentation, and things like that. So there could be a decent amount of overlap. What I'll say also in terms of an advantage of keeping things sort of within this little sort of hub of products is if you are a current Gurobi user, it does look into like your some of your information to help you understand when you have licensing questions or things like that. It's like it'll say, "Oh, you have this type of license. Let me help you here," and things like that. So I think that could be another good use.
But Jerry, kind of as a follow-up to that,
Mhm.
you mentioned that Gurobot is trained on the Gurobi knowledge base. Obviously, some of that of which is public, but is it also getting trained on like past expert interactions or private knowledge base items that something like an Amazon Q would not have access to?
Um, Yes and no. There are some things like if there's anything that we can that we take that very seriously about leaking anything. We don't want stuff to be out there that shouldn't be out there. So we do take that very seriously. But I believe there are some things that you can't just sort of look up. But we do take that seriously, and that we don't want to sort of have anything sort of pop out there that we don't want to. So yes and no.
So next question is the model also able to fetch information from the web, or is it only focusing on the local knowledge base?
It does it's what essentially what we're using was using an instance of Claude as well. So it's yeah it can go look at the outside internet as well.
Yeah, and I'm pretty convinced some of the modeling questions that I was giving it that it probably is looking out on the web
Yeah,
to understand how to do some of those modeling
yeah,
questions. Next question is what protections are there for proprietary information with Gurobot that might be needed to be disclosed during the chat? Are those interactions covered by NDAs that are part of Gurobi contracts? And says I think that I mentioned that I used some dummy data instead of the real one for my example.
yeah.
Actually, I should clarify that. So I I had this customer's data, and then I basically created a randomization that mimicked things that they were doing in their data. So they had different attribute names and different kinds of attributes, and the item number. So I randomly generated data so that I could do this simulation. But I had that exact concern. I certainly in the position I was in
Hmm.
do not want to present that customer data over to Gurobot. So
Yeah.
how do you guys handle that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I would say that yeah, it's probably not, yeah, I would say definitely, but just best practices in terms of any use of LLMs anywhere and putting sort of proprietary information in there is, probably not the best approach. I it's a thing that I think that's is nowadays like a more or less the best practice is if you can find ways like Irv, what you said is to sort of scrub things and randomize things a little bit, but you still get to be able to solve the problem that you want. That's the best approach. I would think now in terms of like disclosures and NDAs and things like that, I would also sort of leave probably get a little bit better answer in that next week as well. But I would say, following best practices of any use of any LLM or any sort of tool like that is sort of what we suggest.
All right. So I don't see more questions, Mike. I think we're at the bottom
I
of the
think,
hour.
yeah, we are done with the questions. So just two upcoming events then. So Jerry referenced Gurobi has an event, a webinar next week.
Mhm.
And then Irv and Jerry will reprise and maybe improve on this presentation on Gurobi Digital Days. And that is, let me say, that June 16th, Jerry?
Yes.
Yes, at 1:45 p.m. That's all through Gurobi, folks. So, and there are lots of related presentations that Gurobi will have as part of Digital Days. So it's an outstanding free event, global. So we would encourage you to participate in that. And again, this presentation will be sending out this information, but it will be reprised again and elaborated on at Gurobi Digital Days. On that note, thank you again for attending. Thanks, Irv. Thanks, Jerry. And we'll see you all again very soon.
Thank you.